Hey friends, welcome to episode 3 of The Fairy Tale Thief. I've filmed the first 2 episodes tonight. I'm hoping to blow through them as fast as I can, get them up as fast as I can. I can't read for too long, otherwise my voice starts getting tired, but I'm doing the best I can, and I will try to get these up. So here we go. Episode 3. On the way to the beach, Alicia prattled on about cheer practice while Brock tried to remember why exactly they had started going out. They had met 2 years before when he just moved from Charleston. She was tall, beautiful, and witty, but now the funny things she said were usually about someone else, making him more uncomfortable than amused. Kayla wears pea-proof panties, Alicia said. That caught his attention. How can you tell? She waved her hand in the air as if she was clearing out cobwebs. You can totally tell. You were checking out her panties? He didn't want to point out that it seemed like a guy thing to do, and pervy. Alicia laughed. No, silly, they were just sitting on the locker room bench. You didn't touch them though, right? Of course not. Maybe she has a medical thing, Brock said, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. Medical things reminded him of the whispering he'd heard the night before. According to the internet, hearing voices was a symptom of schizophrenia, a serious disorder that affects how a person thinks, feels, and acts. A schizophrenic may have difficulty distinguishing what is real from what is imaginary, which, when you thought about it, did crazy things to your head. Who could say what was real and what wasn't? Maybe this whole world, as he knew it, was all a fantasy. He thought he was sitting in his car on the way to the beach, but maybe it was all a dream. Maybe the dreams he had last night were the reality, which would be insane because last night he dreamed he was sharing his bed with a mountain lion. He wasn't afraid of the mountain lion, but it was big and it wanted to cuddle. He could tell that it loved him, but it was making it hard to sleep. It generated a lot of heat and, "You okay?" Alicia asked. "You seem quiet." Brock rubbed his eyes. "I haven't been sleeping well." She slid him another glance and pursed her lips as he pulled onto the Pacific Coast Highway. It's the last day before school starts, so everyone is going to be here, Gabby said as she pulled into the Strand's Beach parking lot. She had to circle the lot a few times before she spotted a middle-aged guy loading his surfboard into the back of his Toyota Tundra. Gabby waited behind him, blinker flashing, watching him unzip his wetsuit. Grace wondered what the man did for a living that allowed him to surf in the middle of the day. She glanced at the mansions clinging to the bluff, wondering if everyone here was so rich they didn't have to work. Work is an eternal principle, her grandfather liked to say, meaning that everyone should work until they die, and maybe even after that. But lately, Grandpa worked really hard on crossword puzzles and not much else. After the middle-aged man shimmied out of his suit and shook his wet hair like a dog, he got into his truck and pulled away. Gabby took the spot, turned off her car, and bared her teeth at Grace. "Any lipstick on my teeth?" No, you're good." "So are you." She opened the door. "Let's go." At the sand's edge, Grace hung back. In Oregon, pale skin wasn't in vogue, but it also wasn't uncommon. Here, she looked like a fluorescent light bulb compared to Gabby's friends. "That's Stacy and Kylie," Gabby whispered, nodding at a guy in his surfer shorts and a girl in a string bikini. "They've been together forever." "That's a long time." "Well, it's been like 5 months, but in high school time." Gabby dipped her head towards the couple playing volleyball. "That's Rohan and Jillian. They just hooked up after Justin's party last weekend. They go to different schools, so people are taking bets on whether it lasts or not." Everyone was so pretty, even the guys. Grace was glad she borrowed Heather's swimsuit. "Hey, everyone," Gabby called out as they approached a cluster of kids on blankets and chairs near the water's edge. "This is Grace. She's a new junior at St. Mag's." Grace smiled through the introductions, trying to remember what name went with what person, while she searched for one face in particular. Not that she wanted to see him. She just needed to apologize. That was the right thing to do. "Where's Brock?" Gabby asked a girl in a red and white polka dot bikini. The girl tossed her brown ponytail over her shoulder. Her green eyes lit up. "Why?" Gabby lifted his shoulder. "No particular reason." "I owe him an apology," Grace told the girl. She studied Grace through slit eyes. "Interesting. You know he's with Alicia, right?" "No, I didn't know. I really don't know him at all," Grace said, her thoughts clicking over who this Alicia might be and wondering if she was the Barbie she'd seen him with in the BMW. Or me. Until now, the brunette gave Grace a wide spin. I'm Amy. So, what'd you do to him? It's embarrassing, Grace said. Amy squealed. I love it when people other than me, of course, do embarrassing stuff. She leaned forward, her eyes wide. You don't have to tell me, but I have to warn you, if you don't, my imagination will come up with mega embarrassments. Only, don't tell me if this involves bodily fluids, because those aren't funny. No fluids, Grace said. Then you got to tell me. I thought he had bullied my brother, so I kicked his car. Amy leaned back. Wow, now I know not to mess with your little brother. Amy took a long swallow of her Coke. She pointed at a house on the bluff. He's probably up there. You mean he lives here? Amy bumped Grace with her Coke can. No, silly, he lives in Bear Ranch, but Cordelia has a cottage down here. It's the one with all the red geraniums. Of course, it was the cutest thing on the bluff. Hey, you live in Bear Ranch, Gabby said. My grandparents do. But you're here now too, Gabby said. Maybe you're neighbors. Grace felt hemmed in and searched for a way to steer the subject away from Brock. Do you want to swim? Gabby tugged off her beach cover in response, and Amy stepped out of her cutoffs. Seconds later, the three of them ran for the water. Some guy, whose name Grace couldn't remember, followed. Gabby looked over her shoulder and squealed. Amy did the same and laughed as the guy grabbed her from behind and lifted her into the air. She let out a startled shriek and kicked her legs in protest. The guy threw her so she spun to face him. Water rolled off his broad shoulders. He shook his head and sprayed her with his dripping hair. Then he pulled her tightly against his wet chest. We know him? Grace asked Gabby, hoping that catching and throwing girls wasn't standard Southern California practice. That's Chase. He's a moron, Gabby huffed out. The guy with him is Oliver, Amy's twin. Oliver looked a lot like Amy, but bigger, broader, and his eyes were more hazel than green. Who are you calling a moron? Chase asked as he caught up with them. A small dog with wiry gray fur barked in protest. Frisking around Oliver's feet, he nipped at his ankles and yapped. What should she call you? Gabby asked without stopping. Wrong question, Chase said. You should be asking, where are you going and what are you going to do with me? He picked her up and carried her into the tide. Gabby put her arms around Chase's neck. I'm not afraid of the water, she told him, or you, but Grace noticed that Gabby shivered as the tide splashed up her legs. His smile broadened. I can be dangerous. Grace felt awkward watching Gabby and Chase and Amy and Oliver, so she dove into the water. The cold enveloped her, taking her breath. She pushed through the wave and cut through the water with clean, strong strokes. Hey, wait for us, Amy called. Grace treaded water, looked back at the beach, and caught sight of Brock. He was with the Barbie, a leggy girl with long, straight blonde hair. He stood on the bluff, blonde, blue-eyed, tanned, and toned. He carried a surfboard under one arm. Their gazes met. Grace dove back into the churning surf. A hand snagged her ankle. She came up sputtering. Chase grabbed her around the waist and tossed her into the air. Seconds later, she hit the water. Holding her breath as long as she could, she sank to the ocean floor. Beneath the waves, she headed for a hairy pair of legs and tackled the back of a pair of knees. Chase collapsed, and she cut away from him. He surfaced minutes later, far enough away so that her splash couldn't reach his face. He looked surprised and then grinned. He lowered his face into the surf and dashed toward her. She easily outswam him to the shore and found a spot on the sand. What was left of the sun dried the water off her skin. The sun felt warm and gritty, nothing like Oregon's soggy beaches. She wrung out her hair and lifted her face to the sky. Chase stretched out beside her and rested his hand on crossed arms. He had his eyes closed, his face relaxed. Grace wondered if he looked like Johnny Depp when he was 16. The water and sand glistened on his body, and she wanted to know everything about him. Tell me who you are, she said, looking into his face. Chase braced himself on his elbow and traced his finger along her collarbone, making her shiver under his warm touch. Who are you? He asked. Grace James. Where are you from, Grace James, and how do you know Gabby? Grace dug her toes into the warm sand. No, I want to know who you are and how you know Gabby. Chase closed his eyes again and leaned back. Gabby and I were a thing a while ago. You mean like when you were 12? He gazed at Grace with intense brown eyes. 14, and don't laugh. Romeo and Juliet were only 14, and they had the greatest love story ever. Maybe, but it didn't end very well. He lay back. Yeah, it didn't. His voice was hard and sad, making her wonder if he was talking about Romeo and Juliet or him and Gabby. The sun sank a little lower into the ocean, and a light breeze kicked up, teasing small flurries of sand. Do you go to Mission High? She asked, feeling slightly chilled. St. Mag's, he said without opening his eyes. Oh, me too. I know. Gabby told Amy about you. And Amy told you? He sat up a smidge higher. Grace followed his gaze out to the water where Gabby, Amy, and Oliver were splashing in the waves. Does she go to St. Mag's too? Yep. Grace felt someone watching, and she turned to see Brock. He stood by the bonfire and looked away when their eyes met. She smiled a shade brighter at Chase. Maybe you can sit with me at lunch so you don't have to sit alone. He flashed a grin. You'd do that for me? I will, she pledged. He looked over his shoulder at Brock. How do you know Brockbank? What makes you think we know each other? He shrugged. I'm pretty good at reading people. She closed her mouth and pressed her lips together. It's embarrassing. She glanced over at Brock. He had his back to her. I'm pretty sure he hates me. Is that why he keeps staring at you? Grace bumped him with her shoulder. Maybe he's staring at you. Chase lifted an eyebrow. Do you think? Gabby, Oliver, and Amy splashed toward the shore. Hey, you guys want to swim out to the island? Amy asked. Chase looked at Grace with a question in his eyes. Sure, she said. I don't know, Oliver said. I'm not sure the organ girl is up for it. Oh, I'm up, Grace said, bouncing to her feet. You sure? Oliver asked. It's a serious swim. And I'm a serious swimmer, she said. Okay, let's race, Chase said. Let's not, Amy said. Turning to Grace, she added, Chase is a CIF champion in breaststroke. CIF, is that like the CIA in swimming? Grace asked. Chase puffed out his chest. The California Interscholastic Federation, only the governing body of California schools athletics. Grace interrupted with a laugh and waded deeper into the surf. Oh, is that all? Is that all? Chase asked. Grace didn't answer, but ran and plunged into the tide. Behind her, Chase yelled, Hey, cheater, Oliver called after her. Grace swam as hard and as fast as she could. The blue-gray water swirled around her, and she pushed through the bubbles. She was dimly aware of the others trailing behind. She thought Chase might have passed her, but she wasn't sure. She swam until her arms and legs tingled with fatigue. Lifting her head from the water, she looked around. The black rock the others had called an island had disappeared. She seemed to be alone. Twirling around, she looked for the beach. She couldn't have gone that far, right? But when she only saw a long stretch of the ocean and the blue sky, her belly filled with nerves. She refused to panic. Maybe, if she just drifted, she would wash up on shore or be carried out to sea. Grace took one deep breath and then another. She looked up at the sun, wishing it could tell her something. She thought of the North Star and how mariners had used its position for guidance. But there were no stars. She'd have to wait for nightfall, and that seemed like a really bad plan because she didn't even know how to find the North Star, let alone how to use it as a compass. Grace opened her mouth to call out, but a voice stopped her. Someone was singing. Grace spun in the water, churning her arms and legs like an egg beater. She didn't see anyone. A wave washed over her and buried her in the swelling tide. Chapter 6. Alicia stood beside the campfire whispering to her best friend, Devin. Devin laughed and whispered something back. Both of their gazes slid toward Chase Dillinger. He was coming out of the water, shaking his head like a wet dog. Brock zipped up his wetsuit, grabbed his board, and headed into the surf. Feeling the cool air slap his face, he felt more like himself. He had surfed in South Carolina too, although it was different there. The water was warmer, the air thicker, and the sun not as direct. But the vastness of the ocean was the same. Brock knew that the Pacific and the Atlantic differed, but they both made him feel small, in a good way. He liked knowing he was just a drop in the sea of the universe. He put his board out on the water, climbed on, and paddled out, away from the gossip and the giggling girls. Brock had to break up with Alicia, but he didn't know how. Using his arms to splash through the surf, he put as much distance as he could between him and the shore. Girls, he decided, should come with an instruction manual. But maybe each girl, like car models, would need their own how-to guide, because not all were the same. Girls had to be even more complicated and unique than engines. He mentally rehearsed the words he'd say to Alicia. It's my junior year, so I have to focus on my classes, because college-wise this year is the most important. But then he couldn't go out with anyone else. Grace's face flashed in his mind. He shook her away. Better to be honest. I'm sorry, Alicia. I'm just not feeling it. No, that was too vague. The pheromones have gone. Too medical and kind of creepy. Alicia, you're mean. That would be too harsh. Water splashed in his face and he blew it out of his nose and mouth. A pelican darted in front of him. He watched it wing away, wishing he could follow it. As he looked for the next wave to catch, something caught his eye. A swath of ebony hair just below the surface. A woman with flaming red hair and startling green eyes stared at Grace. The mirror, she sang without opening her mouth. What have you done with the mirror? Grace started to talk, but water rushed into her mouth. She shot to the surface, gagging. She gasped and choked on the salty water, stinging the back of her throat and burning her eyes. Blanche, Blanche, you must return. Grace sank back beneath the waves. The woman was still there, staring at her. Grace felt drawn to her. She wanted to follow her. She wanted to say her name wasn't Blanche. Before the woman turned away, she pressed a cold stone into Grace's hand. Grace curled her fingers around it. The woman's hair swirled around her like a red cape. She was naked from the waist up and glided through the water without using her arms. Grace followed, aware that she was moving further and further from the surface, but she didn't care. Something took a hold of her hair. Grace tried to scream, but once again, water flooded into her mouth. She gagged and tried to pry loose the fingers that held her. Above her, someone swore. The hand released her hair. Grace sank as if her feet were made of iron, but strong hands grabbed her arms. She kicked and squirmed, but her captor refused to let her go. The air stung her face as she was hauled onto a surfboard. The bright sun blurred her vision. Her head pounded. Her arms and legs weighed 100 pounds each. She tried to see who had pulled her from the water, but she was too tired to lift her head. The woman's voice still called to her, but the singing faded, and the ocean's roar soon drowned out everything. Mermaids, Greek mythology, sirens singing, luring sailors to watery graves. Mermaids foretold the future, but they were also death omens. Grace had tried to follow a mermaid, or had she? The sun warming her skin told her she lived. She had only to open her eyes. Voices floated above Grace. Someone repeatedly called her name, her real name, not the name the mermaid had given her. Grace, Grace, Grace. A breeze lifted the hair on her skin. Blinking, she dimly focused on the faces peering at her, a sea of faces. She didn't know any of them, except one. She tried to recall their names, the girl who had brought her to the beach, her friend, the sister, the boy still in love with the girl. Beyond them was a group of people she didn't know, but to whom she'd been introduced. The only one she remembered was Brock. It came to her that she needed to tell him something important. I'm sorry. It hurt to talk. Her voice sounded as rough as sand. She rolled over onto her belly and tried to push onto her elbows. It was then that she noticed the aquamarine stone in her hand. Are you okay? Someone asked. Scary beans, someone else said. What is she sorry about? A guy asked Brock. Brock ran his fingers through his wet hair. Grace tried to sit up and her stomach rolled. Please don't let me vomit. She closed her eyes, flopped back onto the sand, and tightened her hold on the stone. Someone brushed the hair away from her face, and she peeked open an eye to see Brock peering at her, his nose inches from her face. Grace? I'm okay, she lied with her sandpaper voice. You don't look okay. Grace tried to sit up again. Her name was Grace, not Blanche. And there was no such thing as mermaids. So, why was there an aquamarine stone in her hand? Brock put an arm around her shoulder, steadying her. You want to go home? She nodded. Gabs, you ready to go? Amy asked. Sure, Gabby said, pushing to the front of the small crowd. I can take her, Brock said. She lives next door. I do? Grace croaked. He smiled. You didn't know? Grace shook her head and was immediately punished with a pounding headache. She put her hands on her ears. I think I have water in my ears. Brock laughed, and so did a few others, but only his laugh echoed through her. Come on, he said, taking Grace's elbow and helping her to her feet. Her legs felt like wet spaghetti. Brock tucked the blanket around her. We're borrowing this, he said to someone. That someone grunted in assent. Grace shuffled through the sand, past the bonfire, and through the parking lot. When they got to the BMW, she slid a glance at his bumper to see if she'd heard it, but it looked flawless. Brock opened the door for her. Grace paused. "I'm going to get your car, all Sandy." "It's okay." He leaned against the BMW, waiting for her to get in, standing so close she felt his warmth. Grace hesitated and cast a quick glance at the bonfire where the Barbie look-alike watched with slit cat eyes. Knowing she'd probably made an enemy, Grace slipped into the passenger seat, holding very still, trying not to knock any of the sand clinging to her onto its upholstery or carpet. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked once Brock got behind the wheel. He lifted an eyebrow as he started the engine. The golden rule? Then shouldn't you be kicking my car?" "An eye for an eye was part of the Mosaic Law," he said as he pulled the BMW out of the lot and onto the Pacific Coast Highway. "And who's to say that I haven't duked out your bike?" Grace snorted an ugly laugh. "It's not like you can hurt it." "I absolutely could. It wouldn't look any worse than it already does." "Don't underestimate my bike destruction powers," Brock said in a Batman voice. "It's my dad's," she told him. "I don't think anyone but me has been on it since the 60s. "It's cool," he said with his voice full of laughter. "It makes me feel like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz." He laughed. "Isn't that your grandmother's name?" "You know my grandmother?" "And Hank, your grandfather. They live next door, remember?" How come I don't remember ever seeing you before?" she asked. "We moved here 2 years ago." It had been at least 4 years since their family had been to visit, which sounded mean, but it cost a lot of money to drive all the way from Oregon to Southern California, and money was something her family never had. Palm trees flashed by. The blue ocean sparkled on the horizon. The smell of bonfires lingered in the air. "I'm sorry you had to leave early," Grace said. "I'm not." Brock shot Grace a quick smile before returning his attention to the road. At the intersection, he turned onto the Crown Valley Parkway, following a string of Mercedes, BMWs, and a lone Honda. Grace wondered if she'd ever get used to living here. With a start, she realized she'd forgotten her bag with her towel and Heather's beach cover-up. "My things," she gasped. "Text Gabby and ask her to bring them by." Grace didn't want to admit she didn't have a phone. Brock must have read her expression because he pressed a button on the dashboard. "Call Gabby," he said. The phone rang. Gabby's voicemail answered. Brock looked at Grace expectantly. Gabby, can you bring my bag to work with you tomorrow? I'll pick it up. Thanks." She felt like she was talking to a computer on the Starship Enterprise. Grace settled back against the seat. "What's in your hand?" Brock asked after he ended the call. She couldn't tell him about the mermaid. "I found it in the ocean." And curling her fingers, she showed him the stone. It glistened in her palm. "Wow, it's beautiful. You just found that?" Grace nodded. "Is that what you were doing? Is that why you went under?" "Oh, maybe. It's weird. The whole thing is fuzzy." "Understandable," Brock said. "Really? You think so?" Hope tinged her voice. "Sure. So it wouldn't seem weird to you if I thought I'd seen something in the water?" "No, not really." Grace let out a long breath, feeling better. "What did you see?" "I can't tell you." "Why not?" "It's too weird." "Come on, I saved your life." "You're going to play that card? Is this like Aladdin where I have to be your slave now?" "No, I just pulled you out of the ocean. If I had rubbed your lamp, then probably." He paused. "Absolutely. You'd be really disappointed because I'm not a genie. But you have an aquamarine stone. The legend is that those are mermaid's tears. They're supposed to give protection." "Who needs a stone when she has you?" Shock at what she just said made her gasp. "I didn't mean that. I don't have you. I didn't mean it that way. I just meant, oh, you know what I meant. I meant thank you for saving me, for not being mad about my kicking your car and everything." He looked pleased by her babbling confusion while she searched for a new topic of conversation. "Tell me about Santa Magdalena High." "What do you want to know?" "What do I need to know? I'm new." He sucked in a deep breath. "It's a Catholic school, but probably less than half the students are actually Catholic, although most also went to Sierra." "Sierra?" "No." "The desert?" "No. Sierra Grade School. It's a K-8 school over by the country club. I'm sure you've seen it." "Does it have a large cross and sit on the edge of the canyon?" "That's it." So most of you gone to school together since kindergarten? He nodded. But remember, I just moved here 2 years ago. Where from? Charleston. 2 years before that, we were in Boston. Wow, I've lived in Salmondale my whole life until now, and this is supposedly temporary. What made you move so often? My mom's an antique collector / dealer. She likes to go where the antiques are. But there aren't antiques here. The town of Santa Magdalena is only 30 years old. Shows what you know. The town might only be 30 years old, but the Santa Magdalena Ranch has been around since the 1800s. You should know that. Bear Ranch has been around forever. I still don't get it. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. To be honest, I don't always get it either. Moving's rough. It's hard to be the new guy. He paused and shot Grace a smile. Or the new girl. Although I'm sure you'll do great. She thought about confiding in him, spilling all her worries and fears. How she knew she'd never fit in. How she wasn't even sure she wanted to. Somehow fitting in here would be a betrayal to her parents who considered Orange County and all its glitz and wealth tacky. Ostentatious, flamboyant, and pretentious were some of her dad's adjectives for Santa Magdalena. She wondered if her dad knew her mom had enrolled her in St. Mag's. Brock poked her thigh, interrupting her thoughts. Grace flashed him a smile. Where'd you go? I was thinking about my dad. Brock pulled up at an intersection and waited for the light to change and for Grace to continue. I don't think he knows I'm going to St. Mag's. How's that? They rounded a hill and the Bear Ranch gates came into view. The stone pillars rose from a carefully groomed green belt and black iron gates closed around the guard shack. The golden prison, her dad had called it. She missed him with a tender ache. He's in the reserves and he's been deployed. Well, at least you know where he is, Brock said. You don't know where your dad is? She asked. Brock pulled up to the gates and waved at the guard. The man in the navy and white uniform must have recognized him because a second later, the gates rolled open to let them pass. Or my birth mom, Brock said. Cordelia adopted me when I was a baby. Oh. Grace didn't know what else to say, and oh seemed really inadequate. The trees lining Bear Drive cast long shadows over the road. Her dad complained of claustrophobia whenever they visited. She's the only family I have. Wow, no cousins, aunts, or uncles? Brock shook his head. Would you like to have my grandparents? He laughed, and once again the sound echoed through her in a way that no one's laugh had ever done before. I'm serious. You can have them. I can even throw in a few cousins from my dad's side. There's a ton of those. They're disposable? Brock asked. No, but there's so many of them, I wouldn't even notice if a few went missing. My dad's one of 11 kids. Wow. I know. We get together every year at my grandfather James's farm. Cousins outnumber the cows. Well, maybe, but it's a close call. Cows, huh? And chickens and pigs. Only a couple of horses, though. Sounds nice. No, it's smelly mostly. My dad calls it derriere. Where is this place? Oregon? Grace looked out the window as if she could see the farm in the distance past Saddlehorn Mountain. Central Oregon. My parents met at Berkeley. You're lucky. I guess so, although lots of people would think you're luckier. He pulled down Grandpa Hank's long driveway. The house had been built by her great-grandfather back when Bear Ranch was a hunting lodge, a playground for the wealthy before Rancho Santa Magdalena had even existed. A boxy colonial with a cranberry-colored door and black window shutters. It looked very stodgy compared to the English tutor next door. Is that your house? Grace asked. He nodded. It looks like something from a fairy tale. It does. His voice told her that he didn't think that was a good thing. Brock pulled the car in front of the house and put it into park. See you tomorrow, Grace James. Thanks for driving me home and for saving my life. You're welcome, Brock said. As Grace lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, Toby's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Kelly. Kelly, you there? She said, a smiley face. Kelly, so weird you won't be here on the first day of school. Grace wanted to tell her that as strange as the first day of school would be, it wasn't nearly as strange as meeting an underwater woman. She still couldn't bring herself to call her a mermaid. She texted Kelly back. You think it will be weird there? Just imagine how freaky I'll feel in my red and navy plaid uniform. Of course, the uniform wasn't the most bizarre thing going on. She had to tell someone, but that someone wasn't Heather, her mom, or Tobes. They had all had enough to worry about. She didn't want them to think she'd lost her mind. She glanced at the closed door, knowing that at any minute Heather could walk in. Kelly, you'll totally rock it. Grace studied the rock in her hand, wondering how Kelly knew she was at that very moment thinking about rocks, or this one rock in particular. But they had known each other so long and so well they could talk without words. A look, a raised eyebrow, a twitching lip was usually all that was needed to know what the other one was thinking. But now they couldn't talk face to face. Grace had to speak to her, but not hear. On the other side of the door, she heard the TV. Her grandparents and Toby were watching Wheel of Fortune and calling out letters loud enough for Vanna White to hear them all the way in Hollywood. The smell of simmering spaghetti sauce floated from the kitchen and told her that Heather was making dinner. Even though she knew she should be helping, Grace pulled open her window and climbed out. The warm night air engulfed her. She slunk to the side of the house, found a patch of lawn beneath the shade of an orange tree, and called Kelly. In a couple of breaths, she related all the weirdness. Why do you think the little men and the mermaid both called you Blanche? Kelly asked. I don't know, but don't call her a mermaid. That's just too strange. How do you spell Brockbank? Grace told her, knowing that Kelly was probably looking Brock up on social media. Ooh, hotness, Kelly squealed. He saved your life, so now you owe him, right? Leave it to Kelly to zero in on the guy and forget about the dwarfs and mermaids. He has a girlfriend, she told Kelly. But he drove you home. That means something. Maybe he just wanted to go home, and I provided a good excuse. Grace looked through the trees dividing the properties. The lights from his house twinkled in the dark. She wondered what he was doing, how long he'd been with Alicia, and if he thought Grace was some car-kicking nut job with poor swimming skills. Maybe, but probably not. Through the receiver came the sound of a clicking keyboard. This is interesting. What? According to this, Blanche is a medieval French nickname meaning white, fair. The name is derived from the Germanic word blanc. So, come on, little men like dwarves? Grace squirmed around so she could lean against the orange tree, trying not to think about the little men offering her an apple. Everyone says you look like Snow White, Kelly said. This is too creepy, Grace said. Yeah, it is. Can anyone else see the dwarfs? What are you saying? Well, maybe everything has been too much for you. Your dad's deployment, the move, your new school. I know you don't want to hear this, but do you think a breakdown makes more sense than being stalked by dwarves and hunted by a mermaid? She wasn't hunting me, and stop calling her that. Text me a picture of the aquamarine stone. Grace huffed out a sigh and did as Kelly asked. In the falling twilight, the stone cast a warm glow. Grace quickly stuffed it in her pocket so no one could see it. Silence came from the other side of the line. It's real, Kelly said after a while. Of course it's real. I want to see the dwarfs. Stop it. I can't just take their pictures. Besides, I think they're with the circus. Ooh, you didn't tell me about a circus. Maybe it's not so weird. Are you kidding me? First, I'm accosted by little men calling me Blanche, and then I meet a woman from SeaWorld who calls me by the same name. You're right. You need to come home. You can't stay there. I'll ask my mom if you can come and live with us. We already did that. Yes, but maybe if your mom knew it was paramount for your mental health. Paramount for my mental health? Grace repeated. What's wrong with your mental health? Came a voice from behind. Shocked, she dropped the phone. She turned to see Brock standing on the other side of the stone wall, grinning. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like and leave a comment. Thanks.